There is a moment I want you to sit with, because I think it might be the most misread 4 seconds in freshwater fishing. You are working a bank you like, the cast is decent, and about halfway back, a fish shows up behind your lure. Not a flash, not a guess, a real fish, tracking it a few inches off the tail. It follows past the weed edge, past the shade line, all the way in until you can see the white inside its mouth, and then, right at your boots, it tips down and goes home. What happens next is almost automatic. Rod under the arm, tackle box open, new color, new size, new knot. I have watched anglers do that for years, and I have done the mental version of it more times than I would like to admit. Here is the problem. That fish just spent several seconds telling you what your presentation was doing right, and roughly where it stopped working, and we throw it away, on purpose, about 4 seconds later. So this is not really a video about lures. It is a video about one word, retrieve. Because I think that word is quietly lying to almost everybody who uses it. Ask 10 people on a bank what a retrieve is, and 9 will describe a speed. Fast. Slow, medium, maybe a pause thrown in. That is about 1/5 of the truth, and the missing 4/5 are free. By the end of this, you will have a different definition of the word, a way to read a follower as evidence instead of a rejection, and a short sequence you can run at any spot without opening the box. Let me start where most of us start. Speed. You are not getting bit, so you slow down. Nothing, so you speed up. Still nothing. And on a certain kind of day, one of those actually solves it, which is why the advice survives. And the fair thing first. Changing the retrieve before you change the lure is genuinely good advice, because one bait can look like a healthy fish cruising, a panicked one fleeing, or something injured and dropping, depending entirely on what your hands are doing. And change one thing at a time, because if you slow down and switch baits on the same cast, a bite teaches you nothing. But here is where the speed conversation runs out of road. Speed describes how fast the lure travels. It says nothing at all about where it travels. So the next place people go is depth, and depth is a real upgrade. It is the first variable that admits the lure exists in 3 dimensions instead of on a dial. You count it down, you notice whether it ticked bottom or came back clean, you start picturing the lure instead of watching the rod tip. And it still is not enough, because a countdown gives you one number, at one moment, at one point in the cast. It says nothing about what the lure was doing across the stretch that mattered. Let me put a number on the thing nobody puts a number on. A comfortable bank cast runs somewhere around 60 to 80 feet. Now ask how much of that distance is water where a fish might actually be sitting. Around most cover it is a small fraction. The stump is one spot. The shade line is a strip. The tip of that laydown is about the size of a truck hood. The rest of your cast is transportation. And we grade the retrieve on the whole trip. We judge speed and depth and cadence across an entire cast, as if a fish were watching all of it. It was not. It probably never saw most of it. There is a man worth mentioning here, briefly, and only for what he was trying to do. Glenn Lau spent an extraordinary amount of time underwater in the clear springs of Central Florida, filming largemouth bass for the movie Big Mouth, released in 1973, with Homer Circle in the fishing scenes. Most of us spend our fishing lives looking at 3 things: the rod, the line, and the surface. He went to enormous trouble to look at the same encounter from the other side. And from the other side, a retrieve is not a real handle turning. It is an object crossing space. Hold that image, because the rest of this is built on it, not a speed. An object, moving through water, entering and then leaving the small piece of that water where a decision can happen. So how small is that piece? Some of the cleanest numbers on how far one fish reacts to another come from laboratory work by Jason Vogel and David Beauchamp, published in 1999, with adult lake trout at the University of Washington. In very dim light, the trout reacted from less than a foot away, with plenty of light that stretched to roughly 3 feet, and as the water clouded up, reaction distance fell off fast. Now, that is lake trout, in a tank, with real prey fish. It is not your bass, and it is not a lure, and I am not handing you a magic number for your water. What it exposes is an assumption most of us carry without noticing, which is that a lure crossing a good-looking area has been presented to whatever lives there. Work like that suggests detection can be a matter of feet rather than yards, and that it shrinks hard when the light goes flat or the water goes dirty. So what changes on your next cast? A retrieve that passes 8 feet off that stump has not really asked the question yet, and when clarity drops, the answer is usually not a louder color. It is a tighter pattern of casts, closer to the wood. Which brings me to the part that reorganizes everything else. The important unit is not retrieve speed, it is time inside the decision window. The decision window is the short stretch of your retrieve where the lure is close enough, deep enough, and visible enough for one particular fish to act on it. And inside that window a small sequence has to run. The lure enters, the fish notices, the fish tracks, and then it either commits or it aborts. Every one of those steps costs real time. If your lure enters and exits in half a second, you did not get a refusal. You got a fish that never finished the sentence. Sit with that, because it rewrites a lot of slow days. There is a real difference between a fish that rejected your presentation and a fish that never got the chance to evaluate it. From the bank, they feel identical. They are not the same problem, and they do not have the same fix. So here is the definition I actually use. A retrieve is the path the lure takes, the depth it holds, the direction it travels relative to the fish, how long it stays in productive water, and what it does at the moment a decision has to be made. Speed is one input into that. It is not the thing itself. Path, depth, time, direction, behavior. Let me show you why direction is not a small detail. Same lure, same speed, same depth. 6 completely different presentations, decided by where you were standing when you cast. It can come at a fish head-on, it can cross in front of it, or it can swim directly away from it, which is a common accident and a very hard sell. It can run parallel along a weed edge and stay beside that fish for several seconds, or cut across that same edge at a right angle and be gone in half a second. Same edge, same lure, wildly different amounts of time in front of whatever lives there. And it can hold beside a dock post, or miss that post by 4 feet and never register at all. Not one of those 6 needed a different bait, a different color, or a single dollar. They needed different feet. You standing somewhere else on the bank, or the boat sitting on the other side of the point. So before you change what is tied on, ask where the lure is going to travel, and whether you could make it travel a better line by moving 30 feet. There is a second piece of research that gets at why direction matters this much, and again I want to be clear about what it does and does not prove. Paul Webb at the University of Michigan, along with work by David Harper and Robert Blake, looked at how ambush predators actually take prey, with northern pike as the classic case. They watched pike ease in before committing, not charging across a flat, closing to something like a third to half of their own body length, and then firing. And when they attacked, they aimed at the middle of the prey's body, not the tail. The pike are extreme specialists in that style, and none of it was measured on a bass chasing a piece of plastic. I am using it as a mechanism, not a law. But it is worth carrying. If a good share of freshwater feeding is an interception at close range rather than a long chase, then a fish asked to sprint the length of a boat was being asked for a lot, and when you keep getting hit on the very back of the bait, it is at least worth asking whether the fish is aiming where you assumed. Now here is the part that sounds backwards, and I want to defend it, because it is where a lot of well-meaning advice quietly goes wrong. Slowing down can make your presentation worse. The instinct is honest. Slow means more time, and more time means more chances. But look at where that slowness gets spent. If the path is wrong, slowing down mostly means longer in dead water, and the lure still crosses the good water in the same short moment. You did not add time inside the window, you added time in the parking lot. And the reverse is just as true, which is the part almost nobody says out loud. A faster retrieve on a better line can keep the lure in productive water longer than a slow one on a bad line. Speed and exposure time are not the same thing, and we treat them like they are. Separate them and the moves change. casting past a target and swinging the lure along its edge instead of at it, repositioning so the productive strip runs the long way through your retrieve instead of the short way, letting a current seam carry the lure down the length of it instead of dragging it across. Every one of those buys seconds, not casts. Seconds. Here is something you can do this weekend. On your next few casts at cover you believe in, count out loud from the moment the lure enters the water you think is productive to the moment it leaves. 1001. 1002. That is the whole test. Most people come back with a number between 2 and 4, then look at how long the whole retrieve took. 20 seconds of work, 3 of them spent asking the question. That is the real reason a lot of promising water goes quiet on you. A standing note before I go on, because it matters more than it sounds. Seasons, size and harvest limits, legal methods, and the rules on bait and on moving fish between waters all vary by state and often by the individual lake. Check your state and local regulations before you fish, every time. Now, time alone is not the whole story either, because of what happens inside that window. Almost every good spot has a transition in it, the outside edge of a weed bed, the line where shade meets sun, a current seam, the tip of a branch, the lip of a drop, the moment your lure touches wood and comes free. Most advice stops at pause near cover, and that is a shame, because the interesting part is not that the lure stops, it is that the lure changes. It can deflect off wood and dart sideways, rise as you lift the rod, fall when you kill it, lose speed and roll, tear out of grass and accelerate. Those are different signals, and here is the last piece of mechanics I want to leave with you. Paolo Domenici and Robert Blake published a review in 1997 on fast starts, the explosive burst a prey fish uses to escape. The short version is that survival depends heavily on reacting early and getting moving in the right direction. Prey that responds late or from very close range is in serious trouble. I want to be careful. That is measured on real fish escaping real predators, not on hardware with hooks in it. And nobody has shown that a bass does that arithmetic about your swim bait. Treat it as a plausible reason, not a proven one. But it gives you a sensible way to choose what the lure does at the transition. Something that suddenly cannot hold its line, that stalls or rolls or drops, reads like a target that has run out of options. Something swimming perfectly straight and strong at that same moment reads like a target that is going to be expensive. So put the change where the fish is, not sprinkled through open water. At the post, at the edge, at the branch tip, at the exact place the geometry says something is sitting. Which brings us back to that fish at your boots, because now I think we can read it. A follower is not a rejection. It is the richest information you will get all day, and it is the piece we throw away fastest. That fish noticed, tracked, and got most of the way through the sequence before something told it no. So instead of asking what to try next, ask 5 questions, in your head, while the lure is still dripping. Did it follow until the lure left the zone, and only then peel off? That points at exposure. The presentation was fine, you ran out of window. Fix the path so the lure stays in that water longer. Did it close the distance when the lure sped up, then fade when it slowed? That points at cadence, and it is telling you the acceleration is doing the work. Did it hesitate the moment the lure turned toward you and started climbing? That one is almost pure geometry. Near the bank or the boat, every retrieve rises and turns, and a cast placed so the last stretch runs parallel instead of straight at you changes that ending entirely. Did it stop when the lure came up out of its level? That points at depth. Not the whole cast, just the end of it. And did you get a follow from the same exact spot twice? That is not a lure problem at all. That is a fish with an address, and now you have permission to work it from 3 different angles. Notice what is missing from all 5 of those answers. Not one of them was color. I am not saying color never matters. I am saying it is the last question on the list, and it is the only one on that list you can buy. Paths, angles, and seconds have no barcode, so they get talked about 100 times less. That is the whole explanation, and there is nothing sinister in it. So here is the sequence, short enough to hold with cold hands. Path. Where exactly will this lure travel through water that could hold a fish? Window. How many seconds is it actually in there? Behavior. What is it doing during those seconds, especially at the transition? Clue. What did the fish, the line, or the cover just tell me? Path, window, behavior, clue. Then change the one thing your clue pointed at. Angle if the path was wrong. Depth if the lure never reached their level. Cadence if a fish showed interest and then quit. And give it 4 or 5 casts, because one cast in fishing proves nothing about anything. So when do you actually change the lure? Because sometimes the answer really is the lure, and I am not going to send you out there stubbornly working a bait that cannot do the job. Change it when it physically cannot reach the depth the fish are holding. Change it when it comes back wearing grass every single cast, because a fouled lure is not a presentation, it is a decoration. And change it when the water is dirty enough that a fish cannot reasonably find it, which usually means more thump or more contrast, rather than a different shade of the same idea. Those are functional reasons. Each one solves a problem you watched happen, instead of a problem you invented while frustrated. If none of the three are true, the lure is probably not what is wrong. One more time on the rules, because it is worth 10 seconds. Regulations change by state, by season, and sometimes lake to lake. Check them before you go, and if you are ever unsure of what you are holding, let it go. Now I want to hear from you, and I would rather have the argument than the agreement. Here is my position. I think most of us are refused far less often than we believe, and that a large share of what gets filed under "they would not bite" was really a lure that never spent enough time in the small piece of water where a decision could be made. Tell me where that falls apart on your water. And give me one specific thing. Think about the last fish that followed and turned away, and tell me what it did right at the end. Did it quit when the lure sped up, when it turned back toward you, or when it started to rise? I want to see whether there is a pattern in the comments, because I suspect there is. And here is where I want to leave you. The next time a fish comes in behind your lure and turns off at your feet, try not to read it as a failure. For those few seconds, that fish was doing something no depth finder and no tackle wall will ever do for you. It was showing you the exact stretch where your presentation was working, and the exact point where it stopped. Answer that. Make the smallest change that fits the clue. Move your feet, change the line the lure travels, and buy yourself 2 more seconds in the only water that ever mattered. The tackle box will still be there. It is very patient. It has been waiting for you all season.